This is what Mr. Liu said on October 10th. The U.S. is teetering on the brink of its first ever default on making its debt payments. Now let's talk about that for just a minute. Default occurs when one of three circumstances occurs. Number one, you have a debt obligation that matures, meaning it came due, and you're unable to pay it off. If that were to happen, you would be in default. Number two, if you have borrowed money and you signed a contract in which you agreed to make regularly scheduled interest payments, if you call the lender and say, hey, I can't make the interest payments, you're in default. And they can institute foreclosure procedures against you to seize that asset they loaned you the money to buy so they can sell it and get their money back. Or number three, which we don't talk about much, if the lender lends the borrower money that is considered to be good, and the borrower attempts to repay the lender with money that is not good. Are you with me here? So we don't spend much time talking about that, but in Latin America that's a big problem. Okay, so let's think about it. What would cause the U.S. to default? We don't need to worry about reason number three, so let's think about 1 and 2. What about debt that comes due, matures? How can we be sure we'll be able to pay it off? Here's how we do it. The Treasury knows exactly what debt is outstanding. They know to the day when it's going to come due. And it comes due every week, part of it. So on Monday of every week, it's usually Monday, they tell the Federal Reserve, I want you to go in the open market and I want you to sell some new bonds so that we can put the proceeds from the sale of those bonds into our bank account, because Tuesday we have to write checks to pay off the bonds that are coming due on Tuesday. This is called refunding. It works very well, very smooth, very quietly. We don't even think about it. Second problem, what about paying the interest? Interest rates are extremely low right now due to Federal Reserve policy. Feds call it zero interest rate. If you've been checking your savings account statement, you probably agree with that. Yeah, it's pretty close to zero. So where do we get the money to pay the interest while the bond is outstanding? Because if you're talking about a long-term bond, 20 or 30-year bond, interest is paid every 6 months to the holder of the bond. We use tax money for that. How much tax money does it take? Well, at the present time, with low interest rates, it takes only about 12% of our tax revenues, or 12 cents of every dollar. So now, wait a minute, let me get this straight. If we did not vote to raise the debt ceiling, would that prevent us from paying off maturing debt? No, we sell new debt to get the money to pay off the old debt. If we don't raise the debt ceiling, will that prevent us from paying the interest when it comes due? No, we only need 12 cents out of every dollar that we get in tax money. Well, if those two situations are not a real possibility, if we don't raise the debt ceiling, then what's everybody worried about? What do you think it is? Well, if you don't raise the debt ceiling, what does that mean the next time you need to spend $100, but you only have $80 of tax revenue? Can you go into the open market and borrow that $20? Nope, because you're up against the ceiling. So what the debt ceiling would mean if we did not raise it is simply that the Congress could no longer spend more money than they take in. It's very simple. And that to them is the real crisis. It would mean an end to the spending machine. It's not about protecting the full faith and credit of the United States. That's a smokescreen. Okay, back to Mr. Liu. With the debt limit, if you look for the last minute and you make a mistake, you've done serious damage to the economy, the world economy. It's just reckless. Now, he was making this statement when Mr. Cruz and Mr. Lee and some of the other people were fighting against raising the debt ceiling. And we heard all this talk about destroying our credibility. But if you're tempted to believe that, ask yourself this question. If you have, how many of you have older children, maybe married? Okay, most of you. What if your kids came home and sat you down and said, Dad, Mom, we really made a bad mistake here. We're in over our heads, and we need some help figuring out how to get out of this hole. How many of you parents would encourage your children to continue to spend more than their income? I'd like to see your hands. No, nobody would do that. So we're back to Adam Smith, aren't we? What is wisdom in the family is not folly in a great kingdom. Nobody, even Mr. Liu, would not advise his children to continue to spend beyond their means. And so this is a credibility problem. Our reputation in the world is under assault economically, but it's not because we're not spending enough money. Okay, let's go to the next one. This is the president on September 18. Raising the debt ceiling does not somehow promote profligacy. That's easy for you to say. It is a basic function of making sure that the full faith and credit of the United States is preserved. Well, we've already covered that. That is not true. But apparently my reading of what Mr. Obama is saying is that the world's changed. The old laws of economics no longer work. So here are the new laws. Not raising the debt ceiling would threaten a default. Number two, the ceiling must be raised to protect our credit rating and reassure foreign markets. How many of you would be reassured if you knew that the U.S. government bonds that you were holding, that issuing government was about to go out and borrow even more? Would you be reassured by that? I don't know. Let's go to the next one. One more. And last, those who want to reduce spending in order to shrink our budget deficit are extremists and radicals. How many of you feel extreme and radical? I feel very extreme when it comes to this subject. Now, let's go to the next one. So on September 18, we have the president saying raising the debt ceiling does not increase our debt. On October 16, Congress passes a bill to raise the U.S. debt ceiling and end the government shutdown. This bill, incidentally, was called the Default Prevention Act of 2013. The Default Prevention Act of 2013. Notice the date on that story from the British Guardian newspaper, October 16. Then 2 days later, Friday, October 18, the Washington Times reports U.S. debt jumps a record $328 billion on Thursday. So the president says raising the debt ceiling does not raise the debt. 2 days after we raised the debt ceiling, the debt went up $328 billion. So you can draw your own conclusions there. As Alistair Begg is fond of saying, you're all intelligent people. Now, I wanted to give you this quote from a Treasury Secretary from a different era. This is from Henry Morgenthau, who was FDR's Treasury Secretary. And as you know, the New Deal, the idea on the New Deal is that if we went out and spent money on various projects and so forth, it would stimulate the economy. And so this is Henry Morgenthau in meeting with some bankers who were personal friends of his. Here's what he said. We have tried spending money. We are spending more than we have ever spent, and it does not work. After 8 years of this administration, We have just as much unemployment as when we started and an enormous debt to boot. So compare what Mr. Morgenthau was saying as Treasury Secretary and what Jack Lew was saying as Treasury Secretary. These are different. These two men are worlds apart, you see. Things have changed. Let's go to the next one. And the public understands that. Here is a Pew Research poll. It's a question they've asked for many years. I think it started in 1958. That's the earliest I could find. So the statement goes like this, and you're asked, do you agree or disagree with that statement? The government in Washington can be trusted to do what is right just about always or most of the time. In 1958, 73% of the public surveyed agreed with that statement. In 2013, earlier this year, they took the survey again. It was down to 19. What do you wonder about? Do you wonder about that 19? I wonder about the 19. Okay, let's go to the other one. And then I've read in several places recently, well, it may be bad, but at least we're not Greece. To which I would say, really? Okay, what you have here is a chart from the EU database of the government debt as a percent of GDP. Now, one of the things I wanted to clear up here, whenever someone inside the government, whether it's Treasury, White House, Congress, Federal Reserve, whenever they talk about the debt and how big it is, I'll bet you they will tell you that debt is up to 80% of GDP. And that's because the only debt that they're counting is the debt that is publicly held, meaning by private individuals or retirement funds, hedge funds, banks, that sort of thing. They're not counting debt that is held by the government, by the Federal Reserve, by the Social Security Trust Fund, and so forth. But debt is debt, okay? All has to be paid. So you can see that the green line, the green horizontal line, dashed line, represents the EU guideline of 60%. According to the EU, thou shalt never exceed 60%. Where do you see us? Are we over that 60%? Well, sure, we're up to 100 now. If you look at the last part of that blue line, so we're up to 100% of GDP. Greece is worse. Well, Greece is worse. But you notice a trajectory there. Next slide. Second way you can relate debt in a relative sense, instead of just talking about the number, is to look at what where it comes from. And it comes, of course, from running budget deficits. Every time Congress spends more than they take in, they have to borrow the difference. And that increases the national debt. So the green line, again, is the EU guideline for the maximum deficit ratio. How big should a government's deficit be compared to the economy? That's the question. The EU says, well, no more than 3%. So you see the green dashed line there. That represents their maximum amount. Now, the reason the blue and red lines are below the green line is we're talking about deficits, negative numbers. Okay? You see the zero up there. So you can see that the Greek line does in fact lie below the U.S. line. Their deficits are bigger compared to their economy. But look at the right-hand side of that chart. What do you notice about the blue and the red lines? Don't you see them coming together? Well, not good news. We are becoming like Greece with our deficits. Anybody know how big the deficits are or have averaged the last 4 or 5 years? About $1 trillion. We take in about $3.5 trillion in, we spend about $3.5 trillion. We take in about 2.5. We borrow the difference, so that's about $1 trillion a year. It varies from year to year, but let's go to the next one. I threw this in here just because I'm a little irritated about the zero interest rate policy, but I did think you'd find it interesting that the only two parts, this is a picture of the interest rate